1950s to the 60s, African Americans started to draw connections between what was happening in the present day and our overall struggle for freedom. So as we move closer from the 1920s and 30s, and as we go into the 40s and 50s, which is where we are now, we start to see this rise of this movement. Now, one of the takeaways that I want you to learn, and I'll talk a little bit about what I want us to get from today, because we're not just going to talk about the civil rights movement in its basic, more mainstream way. I want to talk about, I like this, this quote: freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor, it must be demanded by the oppressed, right? As we know, adults and young adults in here, nobody's going to give you anything in life. Everything that you do, you have to take it, you have to want it, and you have to work for it. And sometimes you may have to fight for it. And so this statement is from the 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. And it encapsulates the core struggle of the movement, highlighting the systemic equality that is required, active, uncompromising resistance against the status quo. This is the central reason, or the central idea around the civil rights movement, is that any type of freedom that we want as a people, it is something that we have to fight for. It's not going to be given to you, right? And so as we talk about this movement, the civil rights movement, again, a lot of times we think that, well, before I do that, I want to ask you, where and how did the civil rights movement start? Okay, so the murder of Emmett Till, right? The murder of Emmett Till was a huge impetus for the civil rights movement, very similar to how when we were seeing those black men and women being killed by the police in 2010 and 11, and that kind of helped us galvanize the Black Lives Matter movement, and people were protesting and that kind of thing. So a lot of times when things happen, when tragedy happens, it kind of gets people, kind of wakes people up and say, hey, something's got to be done. So definitely the murder of Emmett Till was a big one. Anybody else? Rosa Parks. So the murder of Emmett Till caused people to plan the boycott, which was started by the arrest of Rosa Parks. So that was another very important part of the movement. Anybody else? One major one that we learned in school is there was a court case, Brown v. Board of Education, right? Which was a court case that was fought by the NAACP and many national black leaders to help desegregate what? Desegregate public schools, right? And allow for black children and white children or children of any race to be able to go to the same school if they lived there, if they could afford it, if they were in the district, right? So these are all things that we learn, right? Like, okay, well, this is the start of these movements. However, what I want us to talk about today is that while those events were important, the civil rights movement was something that was ongoing for almost half a century before that. There was so much groundwork that was laid, a lot of groundwork that oftentimes gets ignored. And had not this groundwork been laid for about half a century, when these things started, we didn't even have the energy and the organizing and the leaders in place to take all of these situations national and to take it global. So there was a lot of work that was being done. So the civil rights movement, while it got popular in the 1950s, we could almost trace it back to 1909 or 1906 when certain organizations started. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his dad was actually, I don't know if he was a president, but I know he was a leader of the NAACP in Atlanta, right? Long before Dr. King was even Dr. King, right? He was just a little boy. And his grandfather was also a part of, I think, either the NAACP or he was also a part of some early organized movements. So that was something that had been in his family for generations, right? And so again, there was a lot of work that was done to help provide the context for then these leaders who were new at the time to come up and to start to make a name for themselves. And you even have people, we're going to talk about this guy as well, but a man by the name of A. Philip Randolph. Anybody familiar with A. Philip Randolph? A. Philip Randolph was actually started something that became popular in 1963. It was a March on Washington, right? But how many know what A. Philip Randolph did as it pertains to the March on Washington? He actually started the first March on, the one we know about is the second one. He actually started the first one, maybe about almost 20 years before that. All right, so we're going to talk about that. So had it not been for that first March on Washington, we may not even have that second one that most of us know about, where Dr. King does the I Have a Dream speech. So these are the things that we're going to be talking about today to help us give context to say, okay, so now in the future, when you hear about the civil rights movement, you'll understand, oh, this didn't just show up. There was a lot of work that was done prior to Dr. King and Rosa Parks and Emmett Till and many of the other names that we know. So the civil rights movement that was a political and a social struggle for African Americans, it was first and foremost a challenge to these laws, to these segregation laws. And so during this movement, individuals and organizations challenged segregation and challenged discrimination through marches, through boycotts, and refusal to abide by the laws. Does anybody remember there were 3 amendments that we talked about in one of the previous classes that were passed shortly after the Civil War? Is it anybody remember those amendments? 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we're going to go there in a second, but these amendments were the catalyst for how segregation came about, right? Segregation was an attempt by a lot of white Southerners to separate the races, right? So it was a way of separating us in every aspect of daily life. Now, there's a difference between separation and segregation. Does anybody know the difference between separation and segregation?
Separation seems to me to be a voluntary idea that one particular group goes on a particular idea, a particular location for their own betterment and infrastructure. And segregation seems to be possibly imposed by one group going to another group about where one group will live, as was done to Black people in this case. So hence inequality of resources, inequality of access to resources, that was not voluntary to be in in any way unequal position.
Absolutely, right? So separation is often voluntary, right? When we all leave here, we're all going to go to our separate homes or separate places of residence, right? And that's voluntary. Segregation would be, well, you're not allowed to go to this home, or you're not allowed to go to this school, or you're not allowed to live in this neighborhood. Segregation provides a hierarchy. So it's not just you being separated, but also you are not given the same rights and the same opportunities and the same resources to elevate socially like somebody in this other group. So there's a big difference between separation and segregation. Separation is voluntary. Segregation is often involuntary. And so segregation was often called the Jim Crow system. Come on in. Segregation was often called the Jim Crow system, and it was named, we talked about this before, it was named after a minstrel show from the 1830s, where this enslaved African American embodied a lot of the negative stereotypes of Black people. And so this character was called Jim Crow. And so when they imposed these laws and these legal policies, they did it and they nicknamed these policies Jim Crow. So segregation became common in the southern states, following the end of Reconstruction. And we talked about how Reconstruction ended. We talked about how as during the Reconstruction era, the federal government was trying to essentially assimilate Black people, or these former enslaved people, these freedmen, into the American society, providing them opportunity for jobs, providing them their own hospitals, providing them their own schools, so that we could find ways to integrate them into society in an equal and fair fashion. That's why those amendments were passed, right? Southerners didn't like that, but there was nothing they could do about it because the South was all messed up from the war. And so by the time they started to gain power again, gain access, gain economic power again, they did a deal with the federal government, and they said, well, we'll allow Rutherford B. Hayes to be president if you take away all of these federal officers, if you allow us to have the South back again and to do what we want to with our Negroes. So if you allow that, then we'll vote for this guy to be president. And that's essentially what happened.
If I may, just to lightly challenge or push back on something you said, maybe. So you were saying that the idea about the Reconstruction, when it came to Black people, was the idea to sort of integrate Black people basically into the society. After the Civil War was over, after Emancipation Proclamation had taken place. I'd like to push back on that a little bit. I'm not sure that I think that it was to integrate Black people into society as much as it was to say that since Black people decided weren't going to go to Liberia or weren't going to go to East Africa or what's now Ghana, that Abraham Lincoln wanted. He was adamant about Black people leaving, but he felt like since the white people had engaged in a civil war between themselves, he said he didn't think that white people had the stomach to make Black people leave. And he admonished various Black leaders that went to the White House to talk about what should be done. They said they thought the Black people ought to stay, and Lincoln said, no, your people can't read. They would be maligned by being around white people, and then also white people would be maligned just by being around us. So I'd like to push back by saying that I think that the Reconstruction idea was that since Blacks were not going to leave, that white people thought the only thing to be done with the Black people was just to have kind of a nation within a nation. So that Reconstruction largely was to create an infrastructure, though unequal, and somehow make that work where Black people would be segregated, but at least they would have their own infrastructure to survive apart from white people. Hence, all of these HBCUs that are, STEM focused, A&M and A&T, all these schools for agriculture, so the Black people can kind of do for themselves while surrounded by whites, without Black people having their own country, even though the land from Charleston, South Carolina, 10 miles in, down to right here in Jacksonville, was supposed to go to the Black people, like their own country. They reneged on that, so what else are they going to do with the Black people? Not give them their own country, but create separate but equal infrastructure. What are your reactions to?
So that's definitely so basically what our brother's saying is that this idea of Reconstruction being the aim of Reconstruction being a way to assimilate Black people into these freedmen into American culture, but instead a response to the reasons behind African Americans not leaving to go back to Africa and also reneging on the promises of giving black folks land via the 40 acres and a mule and other Morrill acts, reneging on that promise. Instead, they would allow for them to be a part of this American society or system, essentially as eventually second-class citizens. And so I would argue that based on the readings of Black Reconstruction by Du Bois and other scholars who've studied Reconstruction, the overall idea of this kind of creating somewhat of an equal grounding for these, millions and millions of Black Americans, of freedmen who are now here. That essentially is the overall reason that I've seen in my research from Du Bois and others about why Reconstruction was initiated. That is a Pan-Africanist view that I could see. I've never read that before, where there is this overall theory that, well, the real reason was because Black folks just didn't want to leave to go back to Africa. That's not something I've ever heard before, but I could see how that could play a role in why there could be this need for you have all of these Black people and you don't have anything to do with them. And however, they do have skills. They have skills, they have a certain level of knowledge, even over your working and even middle-class white folks. And so in order to make this work, in order to bring the South and the North back together, and in order to find a way to ingratiate these freedmen into society, this is a system that we have to figure out. And so that could definitely be another theory as well. Mm-hmm. Correct. Mm-hmm. Right.
And, the special terms of the special order number 15, which did give us a lot of land from Charleston down to Jacksonville, was the beginning of an opportunity to build a nation. And, leaders at the time had met and said, surveyed their own people and said, this is what we want. We want our own land.
Sure.
A nation, but we can still be in relationship with the United States of America as a nation in terms of a military relationship, where we'll send them out to fight on behalf.
Mm-hmm.
It was reneged. So I was agreeing with the more contemporary work. I guess from the African political scientist perspective, that the Reconstruction wasn't a true attempt. It was just 13, 14, and 15 with social and legal contracts that still, kept us as a internal domestic policy, just like Puerto Rico. Yes, there's some sense of sovereignty that Puerto Rico has, but they can still answer their political affairs, their social lives, they still answer to the United States of America.
And there's a book, I believe this is from the perspective of the Free the Land slogan. And so you have the Free the Land motto and the Free the Land, and I believe that's the name of the book, where they have all nation, which does speak to that new African perspective, right? And so yeah, you do have that. You have these different ideas on what is the reason why there was this so-called Reconstruction, or what is the reason why there was this this bringing in of freedmen, right? Whether it's based on the reneging of lands or the reneging of promises, whether it's based on an actual assimilation of Black folks into American society. So you have these different theories, these different ideas on what that looks like. Going back to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, these amendments were passed in order to provide some type of lawful or legal way that freedmen or Black people could actually have opportunities, citizenship, and the rights thereof, as well as helping to ensure that there was no large-level chattel slavery again. However, we also understand that due to the prison system, we see a re-envisioning or reimagining of slavery in a different way. And then, of course, the right to vote. All of these things were done to help find ways to essentially reconstruct America or reconstruct the South. Again, even though these things were existed, African Americans still had separate schools, transportations, restaurants, parks, etc. So there was still this segregation, there was still this separation that existed. And not only was there separation, but they were all also inferior in terms of quality to the quality of the schools, the transportation, the restaurants that white folks had access to. And so for almost the next 100 years, Jim Crow would be the law of the land, very similar to apartheid in South Africa, right? So the system of segregation included the denial of voting rights. So essentially, shortly after the Civil War, there was some level of enfranchisement where Black folks were able to, legally were able to practice voting. However, we also know that the Klan, the Citizens Council, and many other white vigilante groups did as much as they could to try to use scare tactics and fear to keep Black people from voting. And then eventually, during the Jim Crow era, during the Jim Crow segregation, there was an overall attempt at helping to ensure that Black folks, particularly in the South, could not vote. So between 1890 and 1910, all the Southern states had passed state laws imposing requirements for voting, and they were used, these were used to prevent African Americans from voting. And so there were these poll taxes, right, which we've talked about before. There were literacy tests and all of these ways in the South that kept Black folks from voting. And it was also at this time too that a majority of the Black folks lived in the South. Folks lived in the South. So if you talk about having to silence a large number of citizens that were affected by people in office, that were affected by voters, that were affected by laws, these people had no say in their own governance, right? And so this is why segregation was so harmful, particularly for Black folks. So the conditions also for African Americans in the northern states weren't better. So in the southern states, there was this legal segregation. Up north, there may not have been legal segregation as in the same way imposed in the South, but there were still these ghettoized conditions that African Americans were forced to live in. Segregated facilities were not as common in the North, but African Americans were usually denied entrance into the best hotels, the best restaurants. And so African Americans were usually, although we were free to vote in the North, majority of us did not live in the North, and there were still aspects and residuals of segregation from the South that existed in places like Chicago and St. Louis and even New York. And so in the late 1800s, there was a law that was passed that made these laws, that solidified these laws, particularly in the South. And what was the name of that legal decision? Plessy versus Ferguson. Y'all ever heard of that? Plessy versus Ferguson? Plessy versus Ferguson made it legal to have separate but equal trail cars, right? Separate but equal trail cars in the transportation system in the United States. And this set the stage for segregation across the country, right? This set the stage for segregation across the country. So now if we can have separate but equal, right, cars, we could also have separate but equal schools, separate but equal water fountains, separate but equal bathrooms. And so this allowed for segregation to spread rapidly, and that's essentially what happened. And so it was out of this that shortly after this was done, this is actually when the civil rights movement started, because this is when Black leaders, Black educators, influential Black people started to organize themselves, right? And this is when they started to see that we have to resist these unfair laws. I'm sure they didn't think it would take another 60 years to do it, but unfortunately it did. And so to protest these laws, the National Afro-American League was formed in 1890, and then Du Bois helped to create what we know as the Niagara Movement in 1905, that would then lead us to the NAACP, which was created in 1909. And so that is the takeaway information that we have on the table there. And then these are a couple other organizations we're going to talk about to kind of, again, help us set the stage for what the civil rights movement really did. And so in 1910, you have the National Urban League to help African Americans transition to urban industrial life. And then CORE was created in 1942 to help challenge segregation, and CORE, along with Dr. King's Montgomery Improvement Association and other organizations, were created to help really give the gas to the civil rights movement. So the NAACP, and we'll talk about this in a second, but what I really want to give focus on is the Niagara movement. But the NAACP, after the Niagara movement, actually became one of the most important African-American organizations of the 20th century. And the strategy that the NAACP decided to use was the legal strategy. We're gonna fight these laws in court. It is through laws and it is through Supreme Court decisions that these people are able to impose these draconian laws on Black people. And so we're gonna use the law to our advantage. We're gonna take Black lawyers, we're gonna take Black judges, we're gonna take Black people that are able to speak on behalf of us in the legal system, and we're gonna use the laws in our favor. And so that's essentially what happened with the NAACP. Historian and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois was a founder of and leader of the NAACP, and it started at around 1909, 1910, and they used a magazine called The Crisis in order to get the information out to the masses, to get the information out to a large number, to the rest of Black society and Black America, to help them know where it is that we were going as a people, what the strategies were, what the updated information was in terms of legal options, legal fights, and everything that was happening in Black America. And then, of course, many of us know Thurgood Marshall. He was a part of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and this was a fund that raised money to help us fight in the courthouse many of these segregation laws that had been imposed on Black folks all across the country. So before we go into the NAACP, I want to kind of go back to the Niagara movement, because I think this is very important for us to talk about. Did I skip it? Okay, I may have gone back too far. Okay, I'll just stay right there. Okay, I'll stay right here. Okay, so this Niagara movement, a lot of times when we hear about the NAACP, this is the large organization that we know of that I would probably say is the place that oftentimes white people go in order to find out who is speaking for us, right? And who is speaking for our best interests. And while this organization is very important, it was not the first organization of its kind. And in fact, there was a movement before the NAACP called the Niagara Movement. And oftentimes we think of these groups as the same, that the Niagara Movement started and moved into the NAACP, but it wasn't quite that simple. And so in 1905, there was a group of Black intellectuals, one by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois, and then there was another brother by the name of Monroe Trotter. And they formed an organization to fight for civil and political rights for African Americans. And so this Niagara movement, again, was the forerunner of the NAACP. And they formed it for that purpose, but they also formed it because they didn't agree with Booker T. Washington. Because Booker T. Washington was preaching that Black folks needed to forego fighting for legal rights and political rights and civil rights, and we needed to focus on building an economic structure and an economic base in the South for ourselves, right? And so there was this idea that with his, I believe it was called the Atlanta Compromise, was that we needed to lay our buckets down where we are, right? And begin to focus on building for ourselves. And this didn't necessarily mean that we forget or that we ignored all of the rights that were not allowed to us, but that would be our main focus. And of course, as many of us know, W.E.B. Du Bois was not a fan of Booker T. Washington, and there were these arguments that they would have oftentimes back and forth. And so W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a professor at Atlanta University, and William Trotter decided to oppose this, what they would call an accommodationist perspective or an accommodationist strategy. And 29 men across 14 states decided to meet in New York, in Lake Erie, New York, to start this new organization called, they didn't have a name for it at the time, but when they got there, they didn't like, it's kind of funny, but they didn't like the accommodations. And so they saw that it was a nicer hotel with more recreation sites. It was just, they was a little elitist, they came from this educated background. So they liked the hotel across the way better. And it was across the Niagara Falls in kind of the Canada area. And so they decided to move the meeting over there. And when they moved the meeting over there, they had this meeting where they started this organization, and they called it the Niagara Movement in the nicer area over across towards the Canada area. And they created this Declaration of Principles that dedicated the group to fighting for political and social equality for African Americans. And over time, this group grew from about 39 people across states to about 170 members across 34 states. And the organization held its first public meeting in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Who can tell me why you think holding the meeting in Harpers Ferry, Virginia was significant? Who can tell me the significance of that? Okay, so a major rebellion. John, so that was the, is that the John Brown or the Nat Turner? I think that was Nat Turner. That was the Nat Turner rebellion, right? So that was the home, right? That was the basis of the Nat Turner rebellion. And so that's why they chose Harpers Ferry, Virginia to be their first major public meeting. And so they had some state level success. They lobbied against the legalization of segregated railroad cars in Massachusetts. And they rejected, now this is very significant because this is what makes them different from the NAACP. They rejected violence as a tactic while aggressively condoning self-defense, right? So NAACP, again, is the forerunner of the civil rights movement. And we all know that the strategy was what? Nonviolence, right? Nonviolence. However, that was not always the strategy by Black folks. It was always a strategy to not initiate violence, but to use self-defense if necessary. And so the Niagara movement was a movement that condoned self-defense if necessary. They chose to use agitation and protest, the Niagara movement, again, to break away from the accommodationist ideas of Booker T. Washington. And so very similar to today, they held protests, they held rallies, they produced writings like we talked about with the crisis, and they did many things to help get the word out and to help get this initiative out. And so there was legal warfare that was chosen again as the dominant protest tactic to which we would fight Jim Crow and attain Black freedom. And also what's very important is that the very next year in 1906, there was a woman by the name of Barbara Pope. And Barbara Pope refused to move from the Jim Crow section of a Virginia train. And so again, very similar to Rosa Parks and even Claudette Colvin before her, she was move from this all-white part of a train. And so this kind of led to them fighting this in court, and they actually won the case. It was called Pope versus the Commonwealth of Virginia. Pope versus the Commonwealth of Virginia. And this concluded that Jim Crow transportation was illegal. So again, when we talk about Rosa Parks, when we talk about Dr. King, when we talk about the Montgomery bus boycott, this was not the first time this had happened. This had happened 50 years before, and they won. Very similar to them winning in Montgomery in I believe it was 56 when it ended. So again, this is very important, and this allowed for us to see that this was happening a half a century before what we understand the civil rights movement to be. So the Niagara movement, another significant part of the Niagara movement was that it was also all Black. It was an all Black organization, right? Very different from the NAACP. We'll talk about that in a second. But the NAACP was multiracial, right? The Niagara movement was all Black, which showed that there were things that we can do as a people just with us. We did not always have to integrate, or we did not always have to have a multiracial coalition. And so it proved that Black people were fully capable of leading freedom movements for ourselves. Now, so those were some of the positives about the Niagara movement, but some of the challenges of the Niagara movement is that the Niagara movement, like I said, these guys were very elitist, right? They were leaders of newspaper. These were professors. These were doctors. These were people who would have been considered part of this talented 10th idea that Du Bois had pushed forward. And so they were kind of elitist, right? In terms of the leaders. And also in the beginning of this movement, they were very sexist. So they did not allow for women to be leaders in the Niagara movement. They only wanted men. And this was something that actually Du Bois disagreed with Trotter. Trotter didn't want women to lead this movement, and Du Bois actually fought for women to have a voice in the movement, and that was part of the reason why they split. Another part of the reason why they split was because they also didn't have enough money. They kept trying to gain money and resources for the Niagara movement, and it just didn't work. So they failed to gain national momentum. Financial resources were definitely a part of it. They also had, again, internal disagreements between Du Bois and Trotter, particularly on the voice of women in the movement. And so because of that, it started to dissipate. And so then in 1908, Du Bois, along with a woman by the name of Mary White Ovington, started to call for a new civil rights organization. And that organization became the NAACP, which was founded in 1909. And so some of the victories that they had were going against Jim Crow, using the legal victories of the courts, and they decided, well, instead of making this all Black, we will allow for liberal whites to also be a part of this organization, and we will allow for women to also be a part and have a leading role. And this is where you get Mary Ovington. This is where you get another major woman who was a part of the founding of the NAACP. Does anybody know her name? Ida B. Wells, right? And so this is where you start to get more women leaders in this, what would eventually be the civil rights movement. And so these approaches to achieve Black freedom was very important. And another thing is that they separated from the radical approach of the Niagara movement, right? They separated from the radical approach of the Niagara movement, and instead of allowing for self-defense, they strictly focused on nonviolence as an approach and as a strategy to achieving freedom. So this is just a piece of, again, of the foundation of the civil rights movement that I think is very important, because again, it helps us to understand that, again, this just didn't pop up one day, or it wasn't just a bunch of organized men and women in Montgomery that started this, But this was decades and decades of fighting and decades of organizing. Another key part, or another key reason why the civil rights movement became so successful was also things that were happening outside of Black folks and outside of Black society, right? But there was actually things that were going on in the larger society that also helped to give voice and helped to give momentum to the civil rights movement. And one of them was World War II. And so we're going to talk about how World War II played a huge influence in the energy that it gave Black folks, the energy that it gave Black leaders, and particularly Black military men who had went off to war and come back and also became leaders in this movement based on what they had learned in being off in war. So we'll talk about that in a second as well. One person I want to talk about is A. Philip Randolph. And again, A. Philip Randolph, some people know about A. Philip Randolph, and then particularly in Jacksonville, you probably heard of the school, A. Philip Randolph. And overall, you may hear about him, but he's not as popular as I think he should be, because A. Philip Randolph played a huge role in the starting of the civil rights movement and keeping that energy alive, particularly in the 1940s. So he was born in Crescent City, Florida, and his family moved to Jacksonville, Florida. And that was pretty much where he was raised, right here in the city of Jacksonville. And it was very significant because in the late 19th century and early 20th century, Jacksonville had a thriving African-American community. And so again, Mr. Rodney Hurst has a lot of information on that. And there's a lot of information on why, even when Zora Neale Hurston moved from Eatonville in Orlando to Jacksonville, how she began to understand more about who she was as a Black woman because of this thriving Black community that existed in La Vista, Sugar Hill, and many of the other areas right here in the city of Jacksonville. And so A. Philip Randolph was a part of that interclass movement that was happening. He would read W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folks, and these were the books, and this was the literature that convinced him that it was important for Black people to fight for civil rights, and it was important for Black people to fight for social equality. Eventually, A. Philip Randolph would leave Jacksonville and he would move up north, and this is where he would get involved in many organizations, and this is where he would gain his leadership skills, and he would gain his organizing skills. And so he was a part of a couple of groups that didn't quite pan out, but then eventually he would join something called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, right? The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And this is where he gained national success and national achievement, because he was one of the most visible spokespeople of Black rail workers. So working on the railroad was extremely significant to Black folks during this time. This was the one job that we can get, particularly as a Black man, where you can work on the railroad. They had opportunities for growth. There was opportunities to make money, to take care of your families, and benefits that you had working on the railroad. That was very important. And this was before the forming of unions. So there was no union for Black people. There was no group that fought for the rights, the working rights of Black working class, poor and working class workers. So the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters decided to do this. They became the Black Union, and A. Philip Randolph led this. And so essentially he saw that leading in civil rights was the most powerful weapon in America. And by 1940, he became the face of the civil rights movement. So he was who Black people were going to when they needed a spokesperson, when they would go to the White House, when he was essentially the Dr. King of the 1940s, actually, right? So he was kind of the spokesperson for civil rights at that time. So as we begin to go into the 1940s, and we'll talk a little bit more about World War II, but A. Philip Randolph started to realize that, again, not only do we have segregation, but we also have poor working conditions for a majority of Black people. And so he went to Harry Truman and he said, listen, if you do not change these laws immediately, and if we do not have a change in the conditions of Black people in America, he threatened to march on Washington with 100,000 African Americans. He threatened to bring 100,000 African Americans, And Harry Truman knew that it could be possible. He knew it would take a lot of work, but this man had a lot of power and influence over African Americans in the country, and he knew that it was possible. Now, why do you think he didn't want that to be done at that particular time? 100,000 people marching on Washington, D.C. in the early 1940s. Why do you think Harry Truman was like, this might not be a good idea? Exactly. He said, this is not the time for me to be dealing with this. I got so much other stuff going on, right? We're fighting a whole war. And not only that, but there are newspapers, and this is the onset of television. If on top of what we're fighting for, which is democracy and fighting to show that the United States is the symbol of freedom all over the world, and then these people all over the world look on their television or look at their newspapers and they see 100,000 African Americans protesting, this doesn't look good for us. So I got to figure out a way to give these people what they want. And that's essentially what he did. And so, and I think there was a march on Washington, but it was really a threat. A. Philip Randolph couldn't get 100,000 black people, but I think he did get a couple of thousand to go to Washington, D.C., but it worked, right? That was his strategy, and it worked because soon after that, there were executive orders, talking about executive orders, and I know that was a whole thing about a year or two when Trump was passing all those executive orders, but he passed an executive order to create an investigation department that investigated racism and discrimination in the workplace, right? So he did do that, and what he actually do kind of led to Eisenhower eventually desegregating the military in the 1950s. So A. Philip Randolph was very important in doing that, and again, creating this moment and creating this energy and the momentum for what would eventually happen in the 1950s with the Montgomery bus boycott. So the discrimination in the armed forces, as well as the hiring practices of people in the federal government and defense industries, was what A. Philip Randolph fought for and eventually gained for Black people in the 1940s. So again, this is again showing us that next time somebody asks you when the civil rights movement started, you could actually talk about all of these other things that were happening. All of this is essentially the civil rights movement, right? All of this is going on. Again, we know about the 1955 Brown case, and we'll talk more about that in a second, because I think there's something else I wanted to go to before that. Yes, Morgan v. Virginia. So also, before we get to Brown, which again, we'll talk about that, I also wanted to talk about another Supreme Court decision. So again, Brown v. Board wasn't the first Supreme Court decision, right? There were so many other Supreme Court decisions that went in our favor because we had organizing groups that fought for Black people, that we supported, that we funded, and that we trained young leaders to be a part of to fight for us in the legal system. And so Morgan versus Virginia was another Supreme Court decision that was created that made state laws requiring segregations on buses illegal for interstate travel, right? So we see that even long before Brown v. Board, there were these Supreme Court decisions that made these state laws illegal, right? So then the question should be, well then, if there were so many laws, why in the world was it even an issue during that time? But just because these laws were created, one of the things that we talk about is the enforcing of these laws. When do these laws get enforced? Yes, sir.
Now, we say laws, you're talking about laws made by the federal government, right? Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I'd like to raise the idea that today, with the number of states, 50, or even then, less states, Hawaii and Alaska weren't states in 1950.
Mhm.
But that the U.S. is really kind of 50 countries that are basically sovereign with their own government, their own flag, and their own law.
Mhm.
So even though you had laws for the federal government, the states in which most black people were, as you mentioned, were in the South. The South had their own laws, and they didn't have to follow what the federal government said.
Mhm.
So they had laws, but black people had no way to enforce them in basically sovereign countries that didn't see the rights of an African person at all. How would you respond to that? And just like Mr. Obama, I mean, he went out to Arizona one time or something, and the lady who was governor of Arizona, she stuck her finger in his face and wagged her finger.
Right.
I don't care about no law. You can't tell me what to do out in the West, out in the South, and that the government of the U.S. is in Washington, D.C., they thought, and that doesn't have anything to do with where states' rights is, and that's why the NAACP and other groups said that they could put teeth and weight behind the federal government. The federal government could make the southern states do what they didn't want to do, and since that time, the southern states have strengthened their resolve so that they don't have to follow what the federal government says.
I mean, yeah, I would agree. I think that this is why the federal government had to get so involved in the 1960s, because state laws, even though it was made unconstitutional at a certain time, it also takes years and sometimes decades for that to even trickle down to all of the states to actually follow it. And even if you go back to the 1960s, or even though you had 1955, where Brown v. Board of Education made it illegal to have segregated schools for black children, many of you all may still remember a system that was initiated in the early 1970s. Does anybody know the system that existed for black children, even right here in Jacksonville? Not the lottery. It had to do with students being able to go to certain schools. The busing system, right? And so many of you all may be familiar with the busing system, where maybe some of y'all were taken from one side of town and sent to, but that was 55, 65. So that was 15 years after it was already unlawful to segregate children based on race. So it still takes time for those laws to actually be applied. And sometimes you do have to find ways to then go and enforce these laws. So again, very similar to what you're saying, oftentimes, even though these federal laws exist, because the United States functions in a way where sometimes state laws can take precedence over federal laws, you also have to almost get the federal government to not only make the laws, but then now you have to make them enforce the laws on the state level. Yes. Hmm? Sure. Right. Absolutely. Right. And so you do have, and I liked how you talked about withholding funding, because that was another thing that was used to help ensure hiring discrimination did not exist. So we just showed you how in the 1940s, A. Philip Randolph fought for the doing away of hiring discrimination. However, it took all the way up until the 1970s, and does anybody know what that was called, to help ensure that hiring discrimination did not exist, not only in the workplace, but also with colleges? Does anybody know? Affirmative action? The better head. Yeah, so affirmative action, right? And affirmative action said, well, if we see that there is not a certain, not necessarily a percentage, but there's a certain representation of certain groups in your schools, in your workplaces, then you could have federal funding withheld from you. So again, these are the ways in which many of these laws get enforced. But I just wanted to show that Morgan versus Virginia in 1946 was a way of, again, helping to ensure that segregation was fought long before what we understand as the civil rights movement. And then, another organization I wanted to talk about that actually came shortly after the NAACP was the Urban League. And the Urban League is actually the nation's oldest and largest community-based movement that was devoted to helping empower African Americans into the economic and the social mainstream of U.S. society. And the NAACP was very significant. The Niagara movement and the NAACP was very significant to Black folks that were in the South, because that's where Jim Crow was really strong, and that's where it was implemented in a major way. But the Urban League was very important because it dealt with housing discrimination and working discriminations in the North. So as Black folks were moving from the South to the North, we not only needed somebody to fight for our civil and political rights, we also needed somebody to fight for our working and our housing rights up North. And so the Urban League was very significant in that. And the Urban League, very similar to the NAACP, was multiracial. So it was started by a white man and a Black man and a white woman. And so they started the Urban League. Ruth Baldwin, as well as George Edmund Haynes, started the Urban League that still exists today. And so they joined other groups, the Association for the Protection of Colored Women and the Committee for Improving the Industrial Conditions of Negroes in New York. And they founded in 1906 this aid to urban migrants. And so the years from serving Black workers in northern cities existed all the way up until the 1920s and 30s. And then as the Urban League began to expand, they started to expand to actually provide services, education opportunities, and investigate the rural core in some of the poor regions in the country. And if you know anything about the Urban League, they have chapters all over the country. They have a chapter here in Jacksonville, Florida. They have one in Atlanta. They have one in Houston. And so they have chapters in places where there are predominantly Black people and urban sectors where Black people live in and around the city. They also had a magazine. Their magazine was called Opportunity. So the NAACP had the Crisis, that was the Niagara movement, had the Crisis that was started by Du Bois, and the Urban League had a magazine called Opportunity. And this magazine helped to get information out that was related to the problems, the issues, and the suggested solutions that the Urban League had about housing discrimination and injustice related to Black folks that were living in and around the city. Employment was a huge issue that the Urban League dealt with. And by the Great Depression, the Urban League started to fight for social barriers such as labor unions. They began to boycott businesses, and they were the ones that helped to get African Americans opportunities when, I believe it was FDR signed the New Deal. And so as the New Deal began to have programs that were offered to African Americans, particularly during for the WPA, it was the Urban League that helped to ensure that Black folks were able to get access to those opportunities and not just white people. So this was very important as well. And then of course you have CORE, which was an important organization that was founded in 1942, and they sponsored the Freedom Rides on the buses throughout the South in 1947. And sponsoring these Freedom Rides helped to ensure that, again, not only that we had the right to vote, but that Black people were able to safely vote. Because again, very similar to in the 1860s and 70s, even though we had the right to vote, you had folks like the Klan, the Citizens Council, and other organizations that instilled fear. And so these Freedom Rides that were sponsored by CORE, which were large buses, where Black, and again, this was a multiracial initiative where you had these large buses of white folks and Black folks from the North that came down South to help ensure that Black people were able to vote. And so again, not only talking about the passing of laws, but the enforcing of these laws, the CORE helped to test the enforcement of Morgan. So this is something that's very important. When we see laws passed or when we get victories on the federal level and on the legal level, we can't just stop there. We also have to organize ways in which to help ensure that the government does what they say they're going to do. The CORE also helped realize that courts were willing to help, but there was not always an enforcement of the laws. And so this is why this was so important to us. And so again, talking about Jim Crow, talking about segregation, this again is the environment that is helping to create what we know as the civil rights movement. And so these are just a couple of images that kind of give us the picture and kind of get our mind into knowing what life was like during that time, that began to set the stage for a lot of the mobilizing and a lot of the galvanizing that existed, again, long before Dr. King, long before Rosa Parks, and many others. The desegregation of the armed forces, I'll go into that in a second, but I do want to go back a little bit, and I want to talk about Brown v. Board of Education. So, let's see, where are we? Oh, I need to go there as well. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about A. Philip Randolph a little bit as we go closer to talking about the armed forces. So Brown v. Board of Education, many of us know, was a court case, or yes, a court case that led to the decision to desegregate schools. But how did it start? What was the actual thing that happened? It was to Kansas, Topeka. Mm-hmm. No problem. Yeah, no, a man by the name of Oliver Brown. Mm-hmm. He wanted his daughter to go to a school that was that he felt was better for his daughter. But they said that he could only take her to the school in their neighborhood, the predominantly Black school. And so he felt that was unfair. And so the NAACP rallied, and again, it's not the first time, so I'm sure they had many different calls for this. But it was this particular call at this particular time that made the NAACP say, hey, we're gonna get behind this because we can use this as an example and as a way to help dismantle the entire system. So again, when we talk about galvanizing and organizing, and we're gonna talk about this when it comes to the Montgomery bus boycott too, when we talk about galvanizing and organizing, it's not always just about the leaders, and it's not always just about the issue. It's also about timing. Sometimes the timing may not be right for certain events that happen that for some reason doesn't really get everybody excited, right? If we think about Trayvon Martin, everybody remembers Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown, everybody who remembers George Floyd. But there's so many other examples that for some reason people just kind of went over our heads. It doesn't mean that we don't care, or it doesn't mean that they're not important, but I think Dr. King has a quote that actually he got from a white philosopher. I think I'm gonna misspeak on it, but it says something about an opportunity is an idea whose time has come, something along those lines. But it's not just about having an idea, but idea has to meet timing, right? An idea and timing is typically when we see success. Yes. Media plays a huge role, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and that was one of the things that A. Philip Randolph was very important. And so what the sister's saying is that it's about ideas, it's about timing, but it's also about media. Media, if we see, going all the way back to the 19th century, we see that media oftentimes coincides with revolutions, right? Even if we go back to the abolitionist movement. There was a large abolitionist movement that was going on for decades and decades, long before it got popular. But one of the things that made the abolitionist movement popular, particularly for white people, was Uncle Tom's Cabin. The release of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe provided a pictorial view of the dangers, as well as the views, as well as the heinous crimes that were being done in the South. And so with that happening, that kind of led other kind of white liberals and white sympathizers to say, hey, we should be a part of this as well. The civil rights movement became popular, not just because you had these movements, you had these leaders, you had these organizers, but you also had the onset of what? Television, right? Television is now becoming popular, and not just television, but now regular people have television. In the 1950s, your mother or father or grandfather probably was able to afford a television now. And so now we're able to actually see what's going on at the Brown v. Board of Education. Now we're actually able to see Little Rock, Arkansas, right? In 1990 or 1991, Rodney King was beat up by the police, but that had been happening for decades. What made that difference is what? Now it's videotape. So now we can see it on television. That led to the LA rebellion. And then of course, again, we know that black folks and black men and being killed by the police, black men and women being killed by the police have been happening for decades, but seeing Mike Brown on our what? On our phones. Now, when we're on our phones, we're seeing it constantly. And so now seeing Mike Brown and Sandra Bland and all of these dead bodies essentially on our phones and on our social what? Social media, it now sparks us, and now we say, oh, we have to do something. So you have a great point. Media oftentimes accompanies these ideas and these movements, and that's oftentimes what creates these revolutions. So ideas and storytelling are extremely important. And so again, you have Oliver Brown, who decides that he's going to take this to court. The NAACP decides to get behind it, to put their money, to put their influence behind this, and they take this all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, what is very important that I want us to understand is that Brown claimed that schools for black children were not equal to schools for white children, and that segregation violated the so-called Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment, which says that as long as it's, Plessy v. Ferguson says that as long as the facilities are separate but equal, then it is constitutional. Now, what's important for us to understand is that Oliver Brown was not the only case involved. There were actually 4 other cases that all were under Brown v. Board of Education. So he wasn't the only family. The Brown family wasn't the only family that they had took to court, right? There were like 4 other cases under that they used as the example for taking to the Supreme Court. So School segregation first came before the Supreme Court in 1952, and the state court, I believe the state court upheld the decision to keep it separate, and it was upheld at every level all the way up until I think it was like up until 1955 when it was decided that it would be considered unconstitutional. Now, another very important point that a lot of times doesn't get talked about is who was the Chief Justice of this Supreme Court decision? Does anybody know the name of the Chief Justice? Earl Warren, right? Earl Warren. Now, this is kind of gonna go a little spiritual. People may be spiritual and religious, some people may not, but it is quite interesting. Earl Warren became the Chief Justice on this case. But right before Earl Warren, there was a man in September 1953, the Brown v. Board of Education was heard by the justices, when it was first heard, the justices were actually divided on the issue. And a man by the name of Fred M. Vinson was the Chief Justice. And Fred M. Vinson held the opinion that the Plessy versus Ferguson verdict would stand. So he was the Chief Justice that actually said that this would be considered constitutional to not allow for Linda Brown to be able to go to school with white children. So he held that standard. But do you know what happened to Fred Vinson? In September 1963, he died. He died. And so when he died, they had to hurry up and put another justice in his position. And the justice that was voted in at that time voted in, I think typically a justice then is pushed forth by the Senate and by the president. And the president was more sympathetic to the black plight because he wanted the black vote because of all of the work that the NAACP and A. Philip Randolph had been doing for decades before. And so, no, it wasn't Kennedy. I believe that was either Truman or Eisenhower. It was either Truman or Eisenhower. But because of that work, they then nominated Earl Warren to be the justice. And he replaced Vinson, and then what month? It wasn't that long after. I don't know what month it was, but basically the very next year, Earl Justice Warren voted to go against Plessy versus Ferguson and help and say that this would be considered unconstitutional. And that is how we get the desegregation. Well, that helps us have desegregated schools. So some people may say that was divine. Just randomly, this man who we knew was going to vote against this, he just died. And now you have this other man who comes in office and he votes for it, and now we have the Brown v. Board of Education. So again, it's not just about ideas and organizing, but also timing. Sometimes things happen beyond our control and you take advantage of it. And when you're in the position, when you put yourself in a position for success, and when success finally comes, now you can take advantage of it. And so that's essentially what happened with Brown. And of course, you also have the Little Rock Nine, who was another group that helped to enforce the desegregation of these public schools. So, yes. So one of the things I want to talk about is the desegregation of the armed forces. So this was very important as well. And I think it was a good sister here who talked a little bit about how the war played a role in these desegregation efforts as well. Because this order, the executive order of 9981, signed in July of 1948, this helped to desegregate the armed forces. And then there was an executive order that helped to abolish segregation in the military. And so what was happening in this era is that the war instilled in many African Americans a sense of pride and determination, because this was a fight against the Axis powers, and the Axis powers what major event was happening in Germany during this time. The Holocaust, right? And so everybody's talking about freedom. Everybody's talking about the rights of humanity. Everybody is talking about this different world, right? And so as this is becoming the consciousness of all people, it's also raising the consciousness of Black people to say, hey, why are we fighting for freedom overseas, but we don't have freedom here at home? And so this is what's called the Double V campaign. And the military, as more and more Black men were also having opportunities to go overseas and fight, they're also gaining skills on what? Military skills. How to put together guns, how to protect themselves, how to protect the people around them. So they're gaining these military tactics and skills. And then what are they doing when they come back? Defense campaigns. Now they're applying these skills within their own community. And they're saying, well, if I'm over here risking my life to save my country and to protect my country, I should also use these same skills to protect who? My people, right? And so in addition to that, there was another major military organization out of Alabama. Does anybody know the name of this? The Tuskegee Airmen, right? And so the Tuskegee Airmen's combat record in the air over Europe was exemplary, right? Everybody all over the world knew how brave and how intelligent these Tuskegee Airmen were. And the Black pilots exhibited skills that surpassed the Nazis. And so people began to say, well, if these Black men from Alabama, if they're not scared of Hitler and the Nazis, then why should they be scared of white folks right here at home? And so this started to invigorate Black folks all over the country. And it started to invigorate Black folks in various societies and communities all over. And that's where we get what we call the Double V campaign. And this campaign was championed by the NAACP, and it called for a double victory, a military victory overseas for democracy, as well as a domestic victory for Black folks over racism. Yes, ma'am. The who? Oh, absolutely, the Deacons for Defense. The Deacons for Defense is, I think we talked about that in one of the previous classes, but the Deacons for Defense came about in the 1960s, and they were, I would say they were the forerunners to the Black Panther Party, right? And a lot of people don't know, a lot of people think that the Black Panther Party was the first group, right? This more so seen as maybe non-religious group that fought for and defended Black communities with guns, with military strategies. And there was actually a Christian group, right? The Deacons for Defense. And there were a bunch of deacons in Louisiana. It started in Louisiana. And these group of men were former military men that protected civil rights organizers. When we were talking about those freedom riders, when they would come to Alabama, when they would come to Louisiana, when they would come to the South, they protected them. And even though the civil rights movement did not believe in violence and did not believe in carrying guns, they didn't carry guns, but they didn't mind the other people that carried guns to protect them, right? And so Dr. King, even when he was here in Florida, had armed men around him, even though he didn't want it, but they said, if you're gonna be out, you need to understand how they get down over here and you need us. And he absolutely did. And so you have folks like the Deacons for Defense, as well as others who use their military training to help protect leaders during the civil rights movement.
That goes into also what we were just talking about states not following the federal government's ruling on things. When they saw that Black people were getting armed and fighting against like the KKK and stuff like that, that's when they started sending federal troops in to make sure that it's enforced.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is also where you get a lot of the gun laws, not the repositioning, but the rewriting of gun laws in the 1960s and 70s. Because saying, well, wait a minute, we wanted these gun laws to help us, but now these Black folks is using the gun laws to fight for their own rights. So then now that's where they started to change a lot of these laws. And these were the forerunners of what is the Stand Your Ground law, right? So now these laws that have a kind of, they have this racialized overtone to them happen because we started to use the laws to our advantage. We started to use gun laws to our advantage. So that's very, very true, absolutely. So again, talking about this Double V campaign, CLR James, a very important Pan-African historian and scholar, said in his book, "Why should I shed my blood for Roosevelt's America, for Cotton Ed Smith and Senator Bilbo, for the whole Jim Crow Negro-hating South, for the low-paid, dirty jobs for which Negroes have to fight, for the few dollars of relief, and the insults, discrimination, police brutality, and perpetual poverty to which Negroes are condemned, even in the more liberal North." That's heavy. That's heavy. Why? What am I really fighting for? Right? And so he kind of contextualized this in a great way. Yes. This would be, no, that's not Teddy. FDR, right. So this is FDR as we're going into World War II. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So this would be the late 30s going into the 40s. Mm-hmm. And then Truman is the one, he's after Roosevelt and then Eisenhower. Absolutely, right? What was his major? So I think the New Deal was the big one, right? So you had the New Deal, Social Security. Yes, FDIC to protect the banks. So those were like some of his major accomplishments. Also another thing I wanted to say, it was actually Eleanor Roosevelt, I forgot this part. Eleanor Roosevelt was the one that suggested to Franklin D. Roosevelt to get on the side of A. Philip Randolph to help pass these anti-discrimination executive orders, right? Eleanor Roosevelt was a white sympathizer, definitely, for the black plight and the Black freedom movement. And so she encouraged her husband to say, hey, you might want to listen to these folks, right? So she played a huge role in working with A. Philip Randolph. Oh, this is, okay, so now we're gonna get to, because now we're getting into the decade that we know of as it pertains to the civil rights movement, which is around the 1940s and going into the 1950s. And so again, talking about World War II accelerated a lot of social change. Number one, for providing jobs. So work in wartime industry and services of the armed forces, combined with these ideals of democracy, this is what helped spawn the new civil rights movement, right? This is what spawned the new civil rights movement. Of course, you have black migration up north, as well as more black people being able to vote, made Democrats and Republicans say, we need to solicit votes from these black folks, because now a majority of black folks aren't in the South anymore. They're now moving up north. In the present day, more of us are in the South, but during that time, we were moving up north. And so they were like, well, they have more opportunities to vote now. And so because of that, we have to lean more towards the things that they want. So the World War II was helping to expand our consciousness. It was giving us more bravery and courage, because we're seeing things happening overseas. And so now we want things to happen here as well. And I'm not really going into this too much, but I think Dr. Bevel did when she was here, when she talked about the connections that black folks and civil rights leaders were making with communist leaders over in China, as well as in other parts of Asia. And so there was this kind of Black East Asian connection that was happening to help fight for our freedom and our rights over here in America. And so that's another very important piece. I think Dr. Felicia Bevel talked a little bit about that a couple of months ago. But all of these things were helping to change public policy at the federal level and helping to end racial segregation. And civil rights became a national issue at this time, largely because of the spirit of World War II that was going on during this time. So that's another piece I wanted us to get together and I wanted us to talk about. Also, approximately about 65,000 Native Americans had left their reservations to work in these industries as well and serve in the armed forces. And so African Americans, again, we talked about in 1941, had threatened to march on Washington in a fight for fair jobs and freedom. And President Roosevelt took action and banned discrimination in the defense industries, started the Federal Employment Practices Committee, and its hearings exposed racial discrimination and also helped migrants get work in the North. Now, one of the first legal cases centered on civil rights issues was also one involving equal opportunity for Hispanics as well. And so leaders appeared before the FEPC and protested the exclusion of Hispanics from many war industries, especially employers that consider them aliens, even though they were actually American citizens. So this movement is not just affecting and is not just influencing Black folks, we're also influencing freedom and civil rights for Native Americans as well as our Hispanic brothers and sisters, right? So this is, again, very important why World War II was so important to us, and oftentimes what we end up fighting for, other groups, including white people, begin to benefit from it. Another thing I wanted to talk about before we get into the Montgomery bus boycott is the Dixiecrats. And so states' rights, again, going back to what we were talking about why after laws are passed, you still have to get them enforced, because these Dixiecrats still want to maintain the status quo. So states' rights with the Democratic Party, the Dixiecrats was formed in 1948 as an offshoot of the Democratic Party. And as we know, the Democratic Party then was not what we know it to be now, right? Very different. The Democratic Party was the party that did not make lynching illegal, right? Did not even acknowledge the issues of lynching in the South and in the Midwest until I think either Clinton or maybe it was even in the 2000s. But way more recently, did America even apologize for lynching. So the Dixiecrats, my brother. Okay, all right, cool. Was formed in 1948. It was opposed to Truman's civil rights policies. So as we're seeing Truman and Eisenhower fighting for civil rights, fighting to desegregate the military, of course, very similar to what we saw shortly after the Civil War. Now you start to see these Southern Democrats, these Southern racists, forming their own organizations, like they did with the KKK, like they did with the Citizens Council and other groups, and they began to do the same thing. They formed the Dixiecrats to help offset these civil rights policies, and we saw the exact same thing happen in the most recent years. We saw in 2010 to 2020, we saw many opportunities. We saw, of course, a Black president, and we saw some of the benefits that many people, particularly middle-class Black folks, felt from the policies and the initiatives that were created during that time. And now what offshoot political party has risen as a response to that? MAGA. So we see the...
And I'm sorry, excuse me, interrupt. Now, it's the emotional outrage. A lot of those states we're looking at, they're like that even now, and the ones that are in the yellow became red.
Oh.
The same states they're like that now.
Absolutely. So you see, absolutely, states' rights right here in yellow. The red ones, the Democratic ones, and then all of these are your Republican ones, and of course now it's switch. But absolutely, very much so, right? And so we see that all of these, again, you have political offshoots, and the political offshoot in response to some of the advantages and the advances that have happened in maybe the last 10 to 15 years, now this political offshoot of MAGA has been done to help reverse that. So we see, this is why it's important to study history, because the more we see history, the more we see how it applies today, and everything that happens, it just is happening, repeating. And so we also understand the strategies that have been done in the past to help how we apply those strategies today is why classes like this are important, why classes like these are important in your middle school, in your elementary, middle, and high school, and colleges, right? Let's see. So the demands of war and the heroism of Black service members like the Tuskegee Airmen helped to pave the way for post-war integration, because these people are not just allowing these things to happen. They're fighting to maintain their power, and so we have to fight to maintain our rights, right? This pressure led eventually to President Truman. Again, we talked about the Executive Order of 9981 in 1948, which officially desegregated the U.S. Armed Forces. And when this happened, this was important because now younger leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. are seeing this and they're saying, oh, this is now an opportunity for us to take advantage of this momentum. That's why this is important, because again, this is just momentum that's happening that's then eventually leading us to murder of Emmett Till, civil rights, Montgomery bus boycott, all of these things, right? So that's why I say talking about the civil rights movement in this context helps us understand there's so much that's happening that's in preparation for March on Washington, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and all these other things that are happening. And again, this is just one part. The next time we talk about this, we're going to talk about the Black Power, the history of Black Power. So that's a whole nother, I didn't want to put that together because that's a whole nother kind of, history there. So that's why when you get to the 1950s, now you have the murder of Emmett Till, right? And many of us know this story. So the murder of Emmett Till, young boy in Chicago, his family is from Mississippi, his mom is from Mississippi, and they moved to Chicago as part of the migration. They're living in Chicago. She's doing well. She's raising her son. Everything is cool. He has a Chicago state of mind. He thinks about things from a northern standpoint, where things are not like they are in Jim Crow, right? You can talk to white people. You can play with white kids, right? This is very different. He wanted to go down south to hang out with his cousins for the summer. His mama told him no a bunch of times, but he kept asking. And so his family is saying, well, just bring him down here. We're going to take care of him. And he's, much to her chagrin, she decides that she's going to let him go. But she tells him over and over again, this is what you do. You do not, it's different down there than it is up here. Certain things you can't do, certain things you can do. Don't get caught up, right? He's a little boy, so he don't listen to everything, kind of think knows what he's doing. And he goes down to Mississippi to visit his relatives. And while he's down there, he's at the store and he's playing with his cousins. And then allegedly, there's these different stories that are out historically, but allegedly a white woman walks past and he either whistles at her or he says, hey, baby, to her, or there was this engagement that happens between Emmett Till, a little 14-year-old boy, and this white woman, right? So she gets upset. She goes to tell her husband, and her husband gets his friends together, and they eventually find Emmett Till. And when they find Emmett Till, they go into the home, they drag him out, and when they drag him out, they beat him mercilessly, and they kill him. And not only do they kill him, but they kill him and they dismember his entire body. And so when they take him in the middle of the night, and then eventually they take his body and they throw it in the river. And when they throw it in the river, Of course, there is an investigation on where this little boy is. They eventually find him in the river, and when they find him in the river, one of his eyes was gouged out, his head was crushed in. There was a bullet that was found in his head when they did the autopsy, and this is what his face looked like, right? And so many of us have seen this image before because of his mother. His mother is the reason why this image is now so popular, because of course people knew the story of Emmett Till. They had heard of Emmett Till, but like the sister was saying, media, right? Media and images. This is why Rodney King was so significant. We heard of black folks being beat up by the police, but we're actually seeing it. We had heard of things going on like this happening in the South, but the fact that his mother said, I want you to open the casket and I want you to take pictures so that the whole world can see what happened to my son and what they did to my son. And this was a political move. This was a political move to say, this can be done to now be the impetus and raise the consciousness of not only black folks, but white folks to see what is happening in the South and why this is so important and why our fight, all of these decades that we've been doing, is so important, right? And so it's a very important piece because it was out of this murder that actually the Montgomery bus boycott was established. It was out of the murder of Emmett Till. Again, very similar to what we saw in the 2010s with the onset of the Black Lives Matter movement. It is out of these murders. And some people say, why does it take for something like that to happen? Or why do these things get, you have these sensational situations that occur? But sometimes it takes that. Sometimes it takes something out of the ordinary, or sometimes it takes something gruesome or horrorcore for us to then see that something needs to be done and something needs to be done now. And so it was after the murder of Emmett Till that many organizations became fired up about starting to put more work and more effort into fighting for civil rights and fighting for desegregation. And it was out of that the Montgomery bus boycott became successful. And we'll talk about that in a second. Did I see a hand? I thought I saw a hand. No? Okay. All right. So I want to go to talked about that already. Let's see. Crisis. Oh, Ruby Bridges. Okay. So Ruby Bridges, that was that before? No, that was the 6th, that was after. Yeah, so that again was the example of enforcement, right? Months or years really before, she should have been able to go to whatever school she wanted to. But again, not only do you have the laws, now you actually have to have federal troops enforce the laws. And those images and those pictures of these military people walking this little girl into school is just one of those images and examples of not only fighting for changes in laws, but also ways in which these laws are enforced, right? On the state and on the local level. Again, going into now what we know about the civil rights movement is the emergence of Dr. King, right? And I'm not gonna spend too much time on Dr. King because he's a very popular figure. However, I would encourage you all to go deeper into his life because there's so much about him that we don't know. So much about Dr. King that's way beyond the mainstream. So many things about his mental health that I don't think get talked about enough. A lot of people don't know. Dr. King was a very depressed boy and he attempted suicide like twice, right? He attempted suicide twice. He had a lot of things that he had to overcome eventually between that and also his changes in his philosophies, right? He had abandoned, I wouldn't say abandoned, but he questioned Christianity for a long time. He questioned the idea of nonviolence for a while, and he went back and forth between using that as a strategy or not. So there were a lot of things about Dr. King I would highly encourage. We don't have time to go into, but I would highly encourage you to study and to learn. Yes.
I have a Dr. King comment, but you can tell me whether I should make it now or just wait till you do a question and answer.
Let me get to the Montgomery. Let me finish the Montgomery bus boycott, and then I'll be sure to come back to you. But the emergence of Dr. King happens right around the time of the mid-1950s. And so what we know about the Montgomery bus boycott is many of us know that Rosa Parks went and sat down on the bus and sat in the whites only section. And when she was asked to move, she didn't move. So then a police officer asked her to move. She didn't move. And then she was taken off the bus and she was arrested. And then this helped to start the boycott. What many people don't know is that this whole thing was planned, right? Many people think that, oh, well, one day she just sat down and that was it. And that's oftentimes the joke that's been told. But this was a whole planned out event. However, 9 months before Rosa Parks, there was a young girl, I believe she was 6 years old. Her name was Claudette Colvin. And Claudette Colvin was forcibly arrested for the exact same offense. However, and again, when we talk in this class, we talk about the good, the bad, the ugly. We also talk about the issues within our community that we need to deal with. And there was a reason why Claudette Colvin's case was not highlighted as much as Rosa Parks' case. Can anybody tell me the reason? So there was colorism. She was poor, right? Rosa Parks was more of a middle-class woman. You said she didn't have a college education? Oh, Rosa Parks was more educated, absolutely. Somebody said pregnant. So Claudette Colvin was a teen mom. So she didn't quite fit the description that Black leaders felt they needed to show white folks. Because we know how racism does whenever we fight. Oftentimes, one of the first things that talking about the media will do is they will take images of the victim and they get these negative images and they'll post them to try to excuse whatever happened, right? So when Trayvon Martin was murdered and there was this picture of this cute kid taking his school pictures, and then all of a sudden you saw pictures of him with golds in his mouth and pictures of him with a hoodie and hanging out with his friends and making them look like a thug or a gangster, right? And it was the same thing with Mike Brown, and it was the same thing with George Floyd. And so you have these images that is almost used to help justify the injustice. And so there was a time where sometimes as Black leaders, we fell into that. So we said, well, you know what? This was wrong, but she's a teen mom and we can't use her because white folks aren't going to take that seriously. We need a better example of Blackness. We need a better example of a proper Black person that we can use to help justify this movement. So that was the strategy that they used, right? Absolutely. She was months before.
Yeah, so she mattered too.
Absolutely.
She mattered. Every Black person that is sacrificed and shed their blood to the Tuskegee Airmen, they got experimented.
Yes.
That mattered too. Isaac Water, the guy that a serviceman who was killed in the 40s, I think shortly after World War II. He was a veteran. His eyes got gouged out coming from Georgia to Sinsong in South Carolina. Police beat him really severely bad and blinded him for the rest of his life. Beat his eyes out. He had military just coming home from the war.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talked about it, but he mad.
Yeah, all of our. We can go on and on. Absolutely.
I got to bring him up because this man was military. He was a veteran. He just came back from fighting in World War II.
Absolutely. And that's why this is called the People's African History class, because we want to do better than some of our ancestors did by saying it doesn't matter what our situation is as Black people. You can be a teen mom, you can be college educated, you can come from poor background, rich background, whatever. All Black people matter, not just ones that look good in front of white people, right? So that is why this is important, right? And that's why the case of Claudette Colvin is important. And I'm also going to talk about another woman as well, who also was a victim in the same way. We're going to talk about her. But the boycott was planned and executed by the Women's Political Council. So this boycott was actually planned by a group of women. A lot of people don't know this. A lot of people think it was the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was led by Dr. King, and that was more of the Christian men. But they actually came on board after the women had already planned the boycott, right? This is very important. And one of the leaders of that Women's Political Council was a professor by the name of Joanne Robinson. She was a professor at Alabama State. And she was a Black woman who actually 5 years before was actually a victim of this same crime, right? She was told to, it was 1949, she had been subject to a verbal attack by a public bus driver for sitting in the whites only section of the bus. She presented the idea of boycotting the bus in Montgomery about 5 or 6 years before this had even happened. But they told her, they said, you know how it is down in the South, and we don't want to get involved. You just gotta go along to get along. We'll get to the boycotting later. And she was upset. And she kept telling them, no, I think this is the time. We gotta boycott these buses. And she began to plan it for the next 5 to 6 years. Nobody would listen to her. And so even she didn't get what she wanted, she never stopped organizing and she never stopped planning. And so eventually when they planned for this to, when Rosa Parks situation occurred, she went back to the NAACP and she said, now will you listen to me? And they said yes. And that is when they began to start to organize this boycott around the arrest of Rosa Parks. And essentially, initially, the boycott was only planned for one day. It was only planned for one day. But it continued after the boycott ended. Yes, it was supposed to be organize a one-day bus boycott on December 5th, 1955, and its success led to an extended boycott, and several members of the Black community came together to form the Montgomery Improvement Association, and that's where they elected Martin Luther King as president, and having both the Women's Political Council as well as the MIA come together to help expand this boycott into what we know of it to be today. And so initially, it wasn't supposed to end segregation. Initially, the boycott was only to demand a first come, first served seating policy on the buses, to hire Black bus drivers for routes serving Black neighborhoods, and to help ensure the courteous treatment of white drivers. But the legal turning point happened when the NAACP got behind this, right? When the NAACP got behind this, I believe it was 2 months later, after the boycott began, the civil rights attorney Browder versus Gale, they filed the Browder versus Gale case, and they challenged the Montgomery segregation and the Equal Protection Clause. But the district court decided 2-1 that Montgomery bus segregation laws were unconstitutional. So they had actually won the case on the state level, but the state decided to overturn it, and they took it to a higher level. And so they continued to take it to a higher level. And as long as the case was going up to the higher levels, the boycott continued. So they actually won the case 2 months after the boycott started. But because they kept appealing and appealing and appealing, Dr. King, the Montgomery Improvement Association, and the Women's Political Council said, well, we gotta keep boycotting until they actually pass this law. And so it took about a year, right? It took about a year for it to get to the Supreme Court. And once it got to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court actually declared it unconstitutional, that's when the boycott ended. In addition to the fact that it was also causing the bus company to what? Lose money. I mean, really just almost bankrupted the bus company because black folks had decided to withhold their funds. Now, it wasn't just that black folks started to withhold their funds, but also what did they create in contrast to riding the bus?
We actually got collaborated and worked together for transportation.
Absolutely. So,
Yeah, let me also add, and it wasn't even just the blacks and the white section of the bus for that. So let's say if the white section got crowded and another white person got on, this was before.
oh yeah.
They had, if they would actually go to the black section, make whoever black person get up.
Correct.
Or make them get off.
Correct.
Or if the black person was waiting for the bus that company had a right, oh, I'm not gonna give you a ride because you're black.
Because it's crowded. Absolutely.
So it was very horrific.
It was bad. It was bad. Yes. Absolutely second class citizenship. No. That's very important. Because we have to understand the conditions that black people were under. It wasn't just about sitting down on the bus. It was really about being treated as a human being. After you've been working all day, you have the right to sit down just like anybody else. Absolutely. And I want us to stick with that with the taxi system. Black folks created their own taxi system during that time that rivaled the bus system. And I think what could have been, I'm gonna come to you, brother, and then I'm gonna come back to Brother Baruti, is that what Malcolm X was actually teaching during this time was, well, instead of desegregating to get back on the bus, why don't we just keep the taxi system and just fund that, right? But that was more of a separation, self-improvement kind of philosophy that many of the civil rights leaders weren't really thinking about at the time, right? But I think that is an important piece that taxi system showed, like the Niagara movement showed, that we can do for ourselves. When we organize, when we have the right leaders, when we have the right support, we can actually do for ourselves and create better conditions for ourselves without having to integrate. I saw your hand, I saw yours and yours.
I just wanted to go ahead and just contain all those ideas of this does help prove the point of continuous pressure is how movements happen.
Absolutely.
As I do remember a distinction that in the busing system, a lot of the petty cruelties were because drivers were allowed to make discretion that even if there was space for people, that's usually what created a lot of the major strike was a bus driver could feel powerful by dismissing a person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like what you said. Continued pressure is what helps these movements happen, even when it doesn't look like we're winning, even when it doesn't look like anything is happening. You have to continue to put pressure, right? I saw your hand, sister. Oh, yes, yes. Right. So all of these reasons as to why it could be very difficult, right, for us to maintain our own, which is why, again, what we saw with Tulsa, but when you have Black economic power, when you have Black people owning the insurance companies, when you have Black people having our own jobs and being able to provide our own jobs, all of those things allow for, oh, well, if you can't get what you need here, we have our own ecosystem created. So all of those things are very important, again, which is why the self-improvement, separatist movement, right? There's a whole nother type of movement that's going on alongside this civil rights movement. I saw your hand. Oh, no, you good? And then Brother Baruti.
Okay. So recently, Mr. Trump made a statement that a great evil has hit the United States. Much more devastating, he said, than even World War II. And the evil that he mentioned is democratic socialism. And he referenced Mamdani, who's now mayor of New York City, as being democratic socialist, because he said that threatens capitalism. The reason why I made that statement, you'll see in a second. So there's a person by the name of Chad O. Jackson, black man. He's Dallas-based documentarian and researcher. He's producer of the MLK Project. And on YouTube, if you go to YouTube, you'll see a podcast discussion of which is entitled How MLK Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement Destroyed Black America. All right, now I have my own critiques of some of the goals of the Civil Rights Movement. I tend to be more of a Black Power movement advocate and more of a Pan-Africanist sovereignty person. But I just wanted to say about this person, his basic aims. His basic aims, if we listen to his podcast, in fact, it's a growing movement amongst people I would define as Black MAGA adjacent, Black Christian nationalists to the side with MAGA. This person's ideas, which is growing, some of his cohorts, like a podcast named April Chapman, Delano Squires, who's with the Heritage Foundation, and everybody knows the person, the sports pundit, Jason Whitlock. But they're not the only ones. And their basic contention is that the Civil Rights Movement, Dr. King in particular as the leader, basically was a movement to create socialism element, number one, that it was against Western civilization, number two, and that their goals would transform a society with Black people in it that spawned laziness, welfare mentality, and the entire civil rights movement was a Cold War front, as in, more Soviet Union. And I point this out because it seems like there are growing movements now that are critiquing movements like critiquing Dr. King, critiquing the civil rights movement, all to create a mindset that the MAGA movement is correct, just at the time that Black people are more forcefully asking for reparations and are talking about linking in more Pan-African ways internationally. These voices, like I said, Chad O. Jackson, are quietly creating larger voices of discontent in the Black community that's designed to be MAGA adjacent. So I thought I would bring that up because media, like sitting right here, said it's very important. And we have a lot of negative media that's growing in social media that's trying to thwart efforts of self-determination, Pan-Africanism, African history, to actually be MAGA adjacent to support what I would say is white Christian nationalism.
No, yes.
I'm just going to respond, and it may have from what it is historical revisionism, and if they can adequately revise history, like you tell the history, like revise the context, the contextuality of history, then they can tell a different story about why the movement happened. And it's also a hotel road.
Right.
Like if you follow Will Shakespeare, the books, you might be able to ascribe to that particular movement, but there's documented proof that the FBA, or excuse me, not FBA, the AOS movement is tied to far right media and far right pundits and far right corporations.
And the FBA movement.
Yeah, it's historical revisionism, it's an informational, the world information essentially. So revisionist movement. And And I think classes like this are so important because we get to have these conversations out loud and explore history contextually. But it's sad to hear that, the civil rights, and I think it's such a disservice to say that the civil rights movement was good on both parts, meaning by far left folks and far right folks. The civil rights movement was simply a bridge towards the Black Power movement. Like we were talking about the enforcement, one of the teachers talking about the enforcement of federal law, and once you get to the 60s and 70s, when people realize there's no enforcement happening on the federal level, not even the state level, then it becomes a movement about community power, which is what the Black Panthers were, talking where they had their bodies when they came down to the deep south and realized all the power is in the community. They're talking about the boycotts, and they realized that through the civil rights movement. And Martin Luther King did so himself towards himself.
Absolutely. I mean, thank you. Both of you are absolutely correct in that there are these new movements that are trying to bring dissension in our current momentum and current motivation for fighting against MAGA and for fighting against the taking down of DEI and fighting against the movement to take out Black history and sociology and all of these different things that have been used to help give us gas and give us the education, the context, and the framework needed to fight these movements and these struggles. And oftentimes, what's the best way to stop a people is to divide them, right? They know that when we are unified and when all of us are together, there's really no stopping us. So very similar to what was done in the civil rights movement, where I think there was something that was asked, I think they asked the mafia or something like that, like the FBI asked the mafia. No, somebody asked the FBI, what is the single most significant strategy that you use to take out opposing organizations, whether it be the mafia, whether it be the Black Panthers, whether it be radical movements, whatever. And they said the oldest and the best strategy is always informants, right? We always use informants and people inside those groups to help divide them. It always works from the inside. And so that's essentially what continues to happen even today, is they don't use any new strategies. And so finding ways to have organized groups and organizations and people to come in and give us these different perspectives and these different ideas to help divide us. And instead of getting us to go backwards, just have us moving in all these different directions so that there is not as much power in the numbers that we need to have the success that we are looking for. And so we have to be mindful of those things. And even if we have different ideas or different strategies, some people may be along the strategy of civil rights and political rights and desegregation. And some people may believe in separation and self-improvement and Malcolm X's and Garvey's philosophy. And we all have different perspectives, but understanding that we can learn from each other, right? And one is not necessarily better or worse, but we can use aspects of all of these histories and all of these understandings to help us move us to where we want to go. And so we have to be mindful of the division that does happen by larger groups, by our oppressors and by our enemies that try to dissuade us and try to divide us. And we have to be mindful of that and call those things out. That's a good question. The sister said, how do you know if somebody's an informant? And that's difficult because Dr. King had informants all around him, right? Malcolm X had informants around him. Fred Hampton. It could be something in here. We don't know. So that's a really good question. How do we know? Ooh. You don't? I mean, but even America had Benedict Arnold. You know what I mean? So it even happens with white, it happens with every single group. And it is really difficult to tell because they are designed to look like you and be your friend. And they're imposters. The guy who was the closest to Fred Hampton was literally his right-hand man. His first in command was the one that ended up getting him killed. So it's really hard to say. I wish I could answer that question. But all we can do is be on the lookout and try as hard as we can to recognize it, and when we see things like the ADOS movement and these other movements, to try to call it out and say, hey, this looks like this something that is not along the lines of what we've seen our ancestors do in the past. And when we start to see people, when we start to see things that go against what we've seen our people and our elders and our ancestors that we trust have done, and when we see things go against that, I think that is a smart way to tell if somebody is an informant or if somebody is used to be a dissenter. And it's very similar to, don't mean to go too religious, but people talk about in the Christian community where it talks about the Bible, and it says, how do you know when there are things in the Bible that may or may not be what Jesus said or what God said, for those who believe that the Bible is the inherent word of God. And oftentimes it's said that regardless of all of the different perspectives or the different apostles or people that wrote the Bible, they are all supposed to have one singular idea or goal. And so anything that goes against that is oftentimes seen as apocryphal, or oftentimes seen as not being a part of whatever that overall goal is. And so I think that same thing can be applied in the sense of the Black freedom movement. And oftentimes that can be a sign that you're dealing with somebody who is not, dealing with somebody or a group that is not in line with what we want to do as a people. But that's a good question. So I know I think we're like 20 minutes past. I don't know if we have another event happening, but I want to say thank you so much for coming. We're gonna talk a little bit more about the civil rights movement next time. And then in the next one, we're also going to talk about the Black liberation and the separatist movement that also has a long history in our Black freedom struggle. So thank you all again, and y'all be safe. Oh, also something else to talk about too. Angie Nixon, the one who owns Cafe Resistance, she's running for Senate, right? And she's gained a lot of traction. Please be sure to donate if you can to her campaign. Be sure to support in any way. We need more Black political figures who are community minded in those seats to help speak on our behalf, to help create places like this and spaces like this. So please, please, please vote. And please, if you don't vote for nobody else, help us try to put those political figures who do have our best interests at heart, put them in office so that we can have more power. That's where all this comes from. When you have Black political power, you can be able to make these kind of large scale movements. So just wanted to put that out. Y'all have a great day.